Jacob Kane was a man shaped by solitude. His ranch sprawled across the edge of the frontier, a patchwork of golden fields and rugged hills that seemed to stretch endlessly under the harsh sun. The land was beautiful in a raw, unpolished way, but it mirrored the emptiness of Jacob's life. Years of isolation had carved him into a stoic figure, broad-shouldered, weather-beaten, and taciturn. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, it was brief, cautious, and measured. The townsfolk often whispered about him. Some called him a recluse, others a man burdened by tragedy, but all agreed on one thing. Jacob kept to himself. After the Iwaida, death of his wife in a sudden accident and the loss of his only child to illness, the world had become too loud, too intrusive, too cruel. Jacob's heart had retreated behind a wall of grief, and he found comfort only in the rhythm of the land, tending to cattle, repairing fences, and riding out at dawn across fields that seemed untouched by time. Despite his isolation, Jacob was not a bitter man. He carried a quiet strength, a deep understanding of the natural world, and a protective instinct for those who could not protect themselves. The ranch, for all its solitude, was a place of order and routine, where each sunrise and sunset marked the passage of time in a predictable way. He spoke often to his horses and the few animals that lived under his care, finding in them a companionship that humans could no longer provide. The ranch itself reflected his life, sturdy, practical, and self-sufficient. The main house, though modest, was built to withstand storms and intruders alike. Wooden beams, weathered by decades of wind and sun, creaked under the weight of time. The kitchen smelled faintly of pine and dust, mingling with the aroma of freshly baked bread or sizzling bacon, small comforts Jacob allowed himself. Outside, the fences were always mended, the fields carefully tended, and the livestock checked, twice daily. Every task was done with care, reflecting a man who had learned the hard way that nothing worth protecting came easily. Yet even in this ordered world, a restlessness lingered. There were nights when Jacob would sit on the porch, staring at the horizon, wondering if he had closed himself off from the world forever. The wind carried whispers of distant lives, laughter and music from the town, reminding him of what he had lost and what he no longer dared to seek. It was during these moments, when the silence pressed in like a heavy blanket, that Jacob's loneliness became most acute. One particularly quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in streaks of amber and violet, Jacob felt the familiar pang of isolation. He was in the barn, tending to a stubborn horse, when a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears, a faint whimper carried by the wind. At first he thought it was an animal, perhaps a stray dog or a frightened calf. But something about the sound made him pause. It was human. Jacob's hand froze on the horse's mane, and he listened intently. The sound was so slight it could have been imagined, yet there was a desperation to it, a raw fear that pierced through the quiet of his ranch. He felt a strange pull, a mixture of caution and concern, his instincts, honed by years of living, close to the land and understanding its dangers, told him to stay put, but something deeper, a buried empathy he thought long dead, stirred within him. That night marked the beginning of a change. For the first time in years, Jacob's solitude would be interrupted, not by the wind or the animals, but by a cry for help, one that would pull him into a situation unlike anything he had ever faced, and force him to confront not only the world outside, but also the walls around his own heart. Jacob's ranch was usually quiet at night, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and filled every empty space. The only sounds were the occasional lowing of cows, the rustle of wind through the grass, and the distant hoot of an owl. But on this particular evening, that stillness was broken by a sound so unusual, so urgent, that it made Jacob stop in his tracks. At first he thought it was the wind, or perhaps a stray animal, but the sound sharpened into words, faint, yet unmistakable. "Please, open it. I can't breathe." The plea was desperate, raw, and human. It sliced through the quiet like a knife, pulling Jacob from his routines and routines of solitude into something urgent and unknown. His heart rate quickened. He scanned the darkness around the barn and the fields beyond. The voice seemed to come from the far edge of the property, near the copse of trees he had always avoided at night. That area was wild, untamed, and shadowed, a place where no one ventured without reason. Jacob hesitated, weighing his options. He had spent years trusting only himself and his instincts, but the fear in that voice stirred a long-buried protective impulse. Clutching a lantern in one hand and gripping a well-worn rifle with the other, Jacob stepped cautiously into the night. The glow of the lantern cast long, trembling shadows over the uneven terrain. Every snap of a twig beneath his boots made him tense. The voice called out again, slightly stronger, more urgent. "Please, I can't breathe! Help me!" Following, the sound. He reached the edge of the tree line and paused. There, lying awkwardly on the ground, was a large, coarse sack. Its surface shifted slightly, as though something or someone was trapped inside. The sound of faint, panicked gasps came from within. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. He had encountered many dangers in his life, wild animals, storms, and desperate outlaws, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He knelt beside the sack, his mind racing with questions. Who or what was inside? Was this some cruel trap? Could it be a prank or worse, a criminal setup? Yet as he looked into the darkness and heard the raw desperation of the voice, hesitation gave way to urgency. He had to act, whatever the risk. With great care, Jacob knelt and lifted the edge of the sack. His strong hands trembled slightly, not from fear of the unknown, but from the weight of responsibility. The first glimpse revealed the outline of a small, trembling figure shrouded in darkness and fear. Her breathing was rapid, uneven, and panicked. The panic in her eyes mirrored the plea he had heard moments before. "Shh, it's okay," Jacob murmured, though he had no idea if it would calm her. The girl's eyes widened at the sound of his voice, reflecting a mixture of terror and tentative hope. Her frailty struck him immediately. She was far too small to have survived long in such a situation. Every instinct in Jacob screamed to protect her, to remove her from the sack and provide safety and warmth. As he carefully freed her from the binding, she clutched at him, shaking, sobbing, and gasping for air. Her words came in fragmented bursts between desperate breaths. They locked me in. I can't. Jacob's grip was firm but gentle, his hands steadying her. The night suddenly felt colder, darker, and more threatening, as if the world itself was holding its breath. This was not just a rescue. It was the beginning of a story that would unravel mysteries, danger, and hidden truths. The cries of the girl, once faint and distant, now echoed in Jacob's mind, intertwining with his own long-suppressed emotions. The solitude of the ranch had ended, not with the storm he expected, but with a voice begging for help, drawing him into a world he could no longer ignore. The night air around Jacob's ranch was thick and heavy, carrying the smell of wet earth and dry grass. His lantern flickered in the wind, casting wavering shadows across the ground. As he knelt beside the girl, whose small frame shook violently, in his arms a knot of unease tightened in his chest. Something about the situation didn't feel right. He had lived in these lands for years, and instinct had saved him more times than he could count. Yet, despite the unmistakable urgency in the girl's plea, his mind was full of doubts. Was this a trap? Could someone have set this up, hoping to lure him into a vulnerable position? The area around the copse of trees was isolated. and the darkness was thick enough to conceal any lurking danger. Jacob had faced wild animals, bandits, and storms, but the unknown human element was always the most dangerous. He knew the world had a way of punishing the compassionate, and the desperate voice in the sack could very well be bait. He glanced around, eyes scanning the blackened edges of the ranch, every movement of the windswept branches and every rustle in the underbrush made him tense. The lantern illuminated the girl's tear-streaked face, and he saw the sheer terror in her wide, fearful eyes. Her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. "Please, I can't," she whispered, almost losing her voice. The urgency in her tone broke through Jacob's hesitation, reminding him that no matter the danger, he couldn't ignore this cry for help. Jacob took a deep breath and weighed his options. He could leave her where she was, alert the authorities, and claim that he had found a suspicious sack on his property. But even thinking of abandoning her made his stomach turn. He had lived, alone for years, but that solitude had never hardened him to the suffering of others. Something deep within urged him forward, despite the nagging sense of potential peril. He carefully lifted the sack higher, heart pounding in his chest. The girl shifted slightly, her fragile hands gripping his sleeves. Fear radiated from her, in waves, and he realized that she had no one else to rely on. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a game. She was genuinely terrified, and she needed someone willing to risk themselves for her safety. The tension in the moment was almost suffocating. Every sound of the night, the hoot of an owl, the snap of a branch, the distant howl of a coyote, seemed magnified, echoing around the darkened ranch. Jacob's rifle rested nearby, a reminder that danger was always possible in these parts. He kept one hand on the girl, steadying her, while the other remained close to the weapon. The decision to act was not reckless. It was measured, careful, and deliberate. Finally, he made his choice. Jacob pulled the sack open just enough to reveal the girl fully. Relief mixed with shock as he saw her pale face, damp with tears and sweat. She was smaller than he expected, frail and vulnerable, yet there was a fierce spark of survival in her eyes. Her gaze locked with his, silently begging him to trust her, just as he was about to trust himself to act. In that instant, the suspense of the night seemed to stretch endlessly. Jacob knew that lifting the sack was only the first step. The true danger, who had placed her there and why, still lurked beyond the shadows. But in that moment, he set aside fear, hesitation, and uncertainty. Compassion overrode caution and instinct overruled suspicion. He had made a choice, one that would pull him into a story of danger, mystery, and unexpected connection. As he lifted her carefully out of the sack, the night seemed to hold its breath with him. The suspense of what was to come was palpable. The calm before the storm, a delicate balance between fear and hope. Jacob's journey was only beginning, and the choices he made tonight would define not only his fate, but the fragile life he had just saved. Jacob's hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The girl, now partially freed from the coarse sack, trembled violently in his arms. Her breaths were shallow and rapid, and the faint smell of damp earth clung to her clothing. Every instinct he had, from years of living off the land and dealing with unpredictable dangers, kicked in, guiding him to move carefully, efficiently, and above all, protect her. He set the lantern down on the uneven ground, its warm glow illuminating the panicked lines on her small, tear-streaked face. She clung to him instinctively, burying her head against his chest as if seeking the safety she had been denied for so long. Jacob felt a surge of responsibility wash over him. This wasn't merely a case of curiosity or an unexpected encounter. A life, fragile and scared, was literally in his hands. Carefully, he began inspecting her for injuries. Bruises marred her arms, and dirt was caked under her fingernails, evidence of a struggle or prolonged confinement. Her clothes were torn and damp, and she shivered uncontrollably in the cool night air. Jacob quickly stripped off his own worn jacket and wrapped it around her small shoulders, hoping the simple warmth might provide comfort. "Shh. You're safe now," he murmured softly. His voice, roughened by years of solitude, was calm and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos of her panic. She blinked up at him with wide eyes, a mix of fear, disbelief, and the first flicker of trust. Her voice was barely audible, a fragile whisper. They locked me in. I can't breathe." Jacob's chest tightened. The words confirmed what he already suspected. She had been deliberately trapped, left to suffer, and her rescue had arrived by mere chance. The realization made him both furious and resolute. Whoever had done this would not go unchallenged. But for now, his priority was to get her somewhere safe, away from immediate danger. He hoisted her gently in his arms and moved toward the barn, the only nearby structure providing shelter. Every shadow seemed to watch him, every rustling leaf, a potential threat. But he ignored the tension in the night air and focused on the fragile weight against his chest. The girl clung tightly to him, her small hands gripping his shirt as though letting go would send her back to whatever horror she had escaped. Once inside the barn, Jacob lowered her onto a pile of hay, softening her landing as much as possible. He lit a small oil lamp, casting a warm glow over the rough wooden walls. The barn smelled of hay, leather, and dust, a comforting, grounded scent compared to the suffocating terror she had endured. He handed her a flask of water, which she drank eagerly, quenching not just thirst but the first traces of panic. He sat beside her, keeping a protective eye on the barn doors and the surrounding shadows. "You're safe here for now," he said. His tone was firm but gentle. She nodded weakly, still shaking but beginning to calm. The first steps of recovery, both emotional and physical, had begun. But Jacob knew the rescue was only the beginning. The danger that had brought her to that sack was still out there, hidden in the dark corners of the world. Whoever had imprisoned her might return, and he would need to prepare. Yet at that moment he allowed himself a small measure of relief. The girl was alive. She had been freed. And in that fleeting moment, he felt a connection that went beyond duty, a spark of empathy and shared humanity that neither of them could deny. The night outside remained silent, but inside the barn, a fragile sense of safety and hope had taken root. Jacob knew the true challenges were still ahead, uncovering the story behind her captivity, confronting the threats that lingered, and navigating the sudden intrusion of human vulnerability into his long-guarded, solitary world. But for now, the rescue was complete, and for the first time that night, both of them could breathe. As the girl sat huddled under Jacob's jacket in the dimly lit barn, her trembling began to subside just enough for her to start speaking. Her voice was fragile, broken and hesitant, as if she feared that any sound she made could summon the danger she had narrowly escaped. Jacob listened intently, his eyes softening with concern, knowing that the truth behind her terrifying ordeal would explain the desperation he had witnessed earlier. "My name is Lily," she whispered, barely above a breath. They said I couldn't leave. They said no one would find me." Her words were halting, punctuated by sobs and gasps for air. Jacob could see the toll that fear had taken on her small frame, her shoulders hunched, her knees drawn close to her chest, and the faint bruises that marked her arms. Lily's story unfolded slowly, piecing together a nightmare that had driven her to the brink. She had been living with a distant relative, a man she had trusted at first, who had gradually revealed a cruel, controlling side. Over time, she realized she was being used as leverage in a series of manipulations she couldn't fully understand. The final act of cruelty came one night when she was bound and locked into a sack, left in the wilderness on the outskirts of the town, with no one aware of her fate. Jacob's jaw tightened as he processed her words. He had spent years in isolation, avoiding entanglements with people because he feared the unpredictability of human nature. Yet hearing the injustice inflicted on Lily awakened a righteous anger he hadn't felt in years. Whoever had done this had underestimated both her resilience and his sense of justice. Lily choked on her words, struggling to describe the people who had confined her. Jacob knelt closer, offering silent encouragement. "Take your time," he murmured. "I'm here now. You're safe." The reassurance in his voice seemed to strengthen her, as though the acknowledgement of safety was the first step in reclaiming the courage that had been stolen from her. Through broken sentences and fragmented memories, she recounted the terrifying hours of confinement, the darkness pressing in from all sides, the suffocating fabric of the sack, the panic that had made her feel as though she might never breathe again. Every detail she shared painted a clearer picture for Jacob. This was no accident, no random act of cruelty. It was calculated, deliberate, and cruel, a plan meant to isolate her and strip her of hope. Jacob's mind raced as he listened. He began to strategize, thinking ahead to the possible motives of the people who had put her in that sack and what steps he would need to take to ensure her safety. He realized that the immediate rescue was only the first act in a larger story, one that would require both courage and cunning to resolve. Despite the horror of her story, a subtle shift occurred between them. Trust began to form in the quiet, flickering light of the barn. Lily, who had experienced betrayal and fear in its purest form, began to lean on Jacob, not just for protection, but for guidance. And Jacob, who had spent years guarding himself against emotional connections, found a sense of purpose in protecting her, a reason to act decisively and bravely. By the time Lily's story concluded, the night outside had grown darker, and the wind whispered through the barn's cracks. But inside, the space between them was filled with a fragile sense of understanding. The danger had not vanished. It lingered beyond the trees, waiting for the first sign of weakness. Yet for the first time since the ordeal began, Lily had someone to rely on, and Jacob had a mission that extended beyond the lonely routines of his ranch. This moment marked a turning point. The rescue was complete, but the real story, the confrontation, the resolution, and the unveiling of truths was only just beginning. Jacob now knew the stakes, and he would need every ounce of his strength, wits, and courage to face what was coming. The quiet of the barn was deceptive. Though Lily was finally safe, Jacob's senses remained on high alert. He knew the people who had put her in the sack hadn't disappeared. They could be anywhere outside, hidden among the shadows, waiting for a chance to reclaim control over her. The wind outside rustled through the trees, carrying every small sound in sharp relief, and Jacob's trained ears picked up even the faintest crackle of a twig. Jacob gently shifted Lily closer to him, keeping his back to the barn wall. "We have to be careful," he murmured, his voice low and steady. The girl nodded silently, her wide eyes reflecting fear, but also the fragile trust she had begun to place in him. He could feel the tension radiating from her small body, and it only sharpened his resolve. He had brought her out of immediate danger, but the threat was far from over. He scanned the barn for anything that could be used as a defensive measure. A few old tools, shovels, pitchforks, and a rusted axe were arranged against the wall. Jacob grabbed a sturdy lantern and a long-handled tool for protection, keeping one hand lightly resting on his rifle. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This was personal, and failure wasn't an option. Outside, the sounds of the night seemed alive. The distant howl of a coyote mingled with the rustling leaves. But Jacob's instincts told him there was something more. Movement, slight and deliberate, came from the tree line near the edge of his property. Shadows shifted unnaturally, as though someone was creeping closer, testing the night for opportunity. Every muscle in Jacob's body tensed, his mind running through scenarios and strategies with lightning precision. Lily clutched his arm, whispering, "Are they coming back?" Jacob shook his head slightly, but he didn't lie. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice calm but firm. "But if they do, we'll be ready. You're not going back there. Not on my watch." He could feel the tremor. In her hand, a mix of fear and newfound hope. The barn became a sanctuary, but one he knew he had to defend. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Jacob waited, every shadow a potential threat. Then a low murmur came from the edge of the property, a voice, indistinct at first, but unmistakably human. The tone was familiar to Jacob, a cruel cadence that spoke of authority and menace. He knew immediately they had not given up. They were scouting, calculating, and preparing to strike. Jacob's mind raced. He needed a plan to protect Lily and buy enough time to either escape or confront the threat. He moved quietly, placing the lantern in a corner where it would cast long shadows, but not give away their exact position. Then he whispered instructions to Lily, urging her to stay low and silent. Every movement was deliberate. The stakes were life and death. As the figures drew closer, Jacob felt the surge of adrenaline that came with true danger. His years of isolation and self-reliance had prepared him for physical challenges, but this was more than strength. It was strategy, intuition, and the courage to face unknown foes with only one small, terrified girl as his charge. The first brush of leaves against the barn's exterior made Jacob flinch. He tightened his grip on the tool in his hands and waited, muscles coiled like a spring. This was no longer just about rescue, it was about survival. And deep down, he knew that the choices he made in these next moments would define both their futures. The night seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable as the shadowed figures approached. For the first time since finding Lily, Jacob realized that saving her had been only the beginning. What came next would test every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of courage he possessed. The real danger had arrived. The first tense hours after Lily's rescue passed with a fragile quiet, the kind that feels suspended between relief and looming danger. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the distant sounds of the night reminded Jacob that the threat had not disappeared. Inside the barn, however, a delicate bond began to form, one built on trust, empathy, and shared vulnerability. Jacob sat on a rough wooden crate beside a pile of hay, his rifle leaning against the wall, but his attention fully on Lily. She was wrapped in his jacket, knees tucked to her chest, eyes wide but slowly beginning to lose the edge of panic. Her breathing had evened out slightly, though tremors still ran through her tiny frame. Jacob knew that while the physical danger could be addressed with weapons and planning, emotional wounds required patience, care, and a steady presence. "You're safe now," Jacob said softly, his voice steady. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you again." Lily looked at him, her eyes glimmering with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. She had spent so long in fear, trusting no one, that the concept of safety itself felt foreign. But something about Jacob's calm demeanor, his quiet confidence, and the simple act of lifting her out of danger had sparked the first flicker of trust. For a long while, they simply sat together in silence. Lily's small hand, occasionally, brushed against his arm, hesitant, as if testing whether he would remain. Jacob didn't flinch. He understood the delicate nature of trust. It could not be forced, only nurtured. He shared small pieces of himself in quiet conversation. The routines of the ranch, the names of his horses, the rhythm of life that had filled his solitude. These mundane details grounded Lily, offering a stark contrast to the chaos she had just escaped. "Do you have a place to go?" Jacob finally asked gently. His words were careful, avoiding any implication that she had to leave. Lily shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No, nowhere safe," she admitted. The admission struck Jacob sharply. For years he had kept his distance from others to protect himself from grief and betrayal. But now, confronted with her vulnerability, he felt a surge of protective instinct that went beyond duty. It was personal. He offered her food and water, simple sustenance that went beyond nourishment. Each small act of care became a building block for trust. When she ate and drank, her eyes met his, and for a moment Jacob saw a glimmer of the girl she had once been, curious, alert, and alive, rather than broken and fearful. The barn, with its rustic walls and faint scent of hay, became a temporary haven, a place where fear could be set aside for a few precious moments. As night deepened, Jacob and Lily began to share more than just physical space. They shared stories, fragments of their pasts, and subtle acknowledgments of their emotions. Jacob spoke of his losses, of the loneliness that had defined his life, and Lily, in turn, shared memories of a home that had never been safe. Through these exchanges, a bond formed, a silent understanding that they were now linked, not by circumstance alone, but by the trust that had begun to grow between them. Yet, despite the warmth of the barn and the budding trust, Jacob never let his guard down completely. He remained aware that the danger outside could return at any moment. Every sound from the shadows, every rustle of leaves, reminded him that their safety was fragile, but he also understood that fear could not dominate their lives. To protect her effectively, he needed to cultivate both courage and connection. By the time the first light of dawn threatened the edges of the barn, Jacob and Lily had taken a subtle but crucial step. Trust had begun to replace terror, and hope had started to flicker where despair had once reigned. The bond formed in that night of terror and rescue would be their foundation, guiding them through the challenges still to come. The calm Jacob and Lily had briefly found was shattered as the shadows beyond the barn stirred with life. The distant rustling of leaves became deliberate, calculated movements, and faint voices carried through the night air. The people responsible for Lily's captivity had tracked her down, and now the threat loomed closer than ever. Jacob's body tensed. Every muscle was ready. This was the moment that would test both his courage and his cunning. He motioned for Lily to stay low behind a stack of hay. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded obediently, trusting him completely. Jacob's mind raced through the possibilities. Escape, confrontation, distraction. There was no time to hesitate. His years of solitude and survival on the rugged ranch had trained him to react under pressure, to use the environment to his advantage. Tonight, those instincts would be critical. The first figure emerged from the tree line, a tall man with a harsh glare, scanning the area for any sign of movement. Jacob had a clear view from the barn door and used the shadows to remain hidden. He could see 3 more figures trailing behind, all armed with crude weapons, their steps deliberate and menacing. Each movement they made betrayed their confidence, their expectation that they had the upper hand. They had underestimated Jacob. He whispered instructions to Lily, his voice calm but urgent. "Stay behind me. Don't make a sound. Do exactly as I say." She nodded, pressing herself into the hay and covering her eyes as best she could. Jacob's hands gripped his rifle, but he did not rely solely on firepower. He had learned the value of strategy, of creating diversions and exploiting weaknesses. Jacob's first move was subtle. He opened the barn door just enough to cast a faint light outside, then dropped a lantern slightly off to the side. The flickering glow drew the figure's attention, just as he had hoped. The leader cursed under his breath and stepped toward the barn, eager to investigate. That moment of distraction gave Jacob the opening he needed. He slipped quietly out. a side exit, taking the path that allowed him to circle behind the intruders. The confrontation escalated quickly. Jacob moved like a shadow, his every step calculated. He used his knowledge of the terrain, the uneven ground, the trees, the low hills, to create barriers between them and Lily. He forced the intruders into positions where their numbers counted, for less than their confusion. The tension was electric. One misstep could spell disaster, yet Jacob remained composed, his focus absolute. From inside the barn, Lily watched in tense silence as Jacob engaged the men. Her heart pounded, fear mingling with awe. She had come to rely on him, and now she saw firsthand the resourcefulness and determination that had saved her life. Each maneuver Jacob made, each calculated risk, was a lesson in courage, strategy, and resilience. The leader finally realized they were being outsmarted. Frustration and rage colored his movements, making him reckless. Jacob seized the opportunity, using a fallen branch as a makeshift weapon to knock the man off balance. The other two were equally caught off guard by his agility and the advantage of the terrain. Within moments, the tide had shifted. The intruders were disoriented, their confidence shattered. By the time the confrontation ended, Jacob had secured both the intruders and Lily, ensuring no further immediate threat. The men were forced to retreat, limping back toward the woods, leaving Jacob and Lily standing together amid the chaos. The night was silent again, but the sense of danger had not entirely lifted, it had merely transformed. Jacob knelt beside Lily, checking her for injuries, ensuring she was unharmed. "It's over for now," he whispered. She clung to him, trembling but safe. This confrontation had tested them both, but it had also solidified their bond. Together, they had faced the darkness and survived. The night had shown Jacob one undeniable truth. Protecting Lily required more than strength or skill. It required trust, courage, and an unwavering resolve to face danger head-on. And as dawn approached, painting the horizon with muted light, Jacob knew the battles ahead might be even more challenging, but they would face them together. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the barn walls, casting long, gentle beams across the hay-strewn floor. Jacob and Lily sat together, exhausted but safe, their bodies still trembling from the adrenaline of the previous night's confrontation. The danger from the intruders had passed, for now, but a deeper, more personal revelation awaited. Lily had remained quiet since the men had retreated, her hands clutching Jacob's jacket as if drawing strength from him. Now, in the fragile calm of morning, she began to speak. "There's something I need to tell you," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words carried the weight of long-held fear and a secret she had feared would put them both in jeopardy. Jacob's eyes softened, his expression patient and steady. He nodded for her to continue, silently urging her to trust him with the truth. Lily took a deep breath. "The people who put me in that sack, they aren't just strangers. They're connected to my family. My uncle. He wanted something from me, something I didn't understand until now." Her voice trembled as she spoke, revealing that her kidnapping was part of a larger, sinister plan involving inheritance and hidden family secrets. The revelation hit Jacob like a physical blow. This was no random act of cruelty. It was calculated, deeply personal, and rooted in betrayal. Jacob felt a mix of anger, concern, and resolve. He had rescued Lily from immediate danger, but now he realized that the threat was more complicated and far-reaching than he had anticipated. Whoever had orchestrated her confinement was not just dangerous. They were cunning, powerful, and intimately tied to her life. The stakes had escalated, and the resolution of the story would require more than courage and skill. It would demand strategy, patience, and unwavering trust. As Lily continued, she disclosed another layer of the secret. She was the rightful heir to a portion of her family's property, a fact that her uncle had tried to suppress through fear and manipulation. This knowledge explained why she had been targeted, and it illuminated the urgency behind her cries for help. Jacob realized that saving her was not just an act of compassion, it was a moral imperative to restore justice, to ensure that the cruel and greedy could not continue to control her life. Jacob's mind raced, connecting the pieces. The sack, the confinement, the calculated cruelty, it was all part of a plan that he now understood. But he also recognized that the revelation brought with it a new opportunity. By protecting Lily and helping her reclaim her life, he could finally channel his isolation, his strength, and his cunning towards something meaningful. The loneliness that had defined him for years could now be transformed into purpose. Together, they began to plan their next steps. Jacob would help her, confront the uncle legally and safely, gathering evidence and allies while ensuring that they remained beyond the reach of immediate danger. Lily, though still trembling, drew strength from Jacob's presence, realizing that she had someone who would fight alongside her, someone she could trust unconditionally. The revelation also deepened their bond. The trust that had begun to form in the darkness of the barn now solidified into mutual reliance and understanding. They were no longer simply rescuer and rescued. They were allies facing a larger challenge, bound by the night's events and the shared journey of survival, courage, and moral duty. As the morning sun rose fully, Jacob and Lily stepped outside the barn, taking in the ranch, the fields, and the vast horizon that stretched beyond. The immediate danger had passed, but the story was far from over. Yet in that moment, a sense of resolution settled over them. The truth had been revealed, the threat had been confronted, and for the first time since the ordeal began, both of them could breathe freely, not just in body, but in spirit. The path ahead was uncertain, but Jacob understood one thing with clarity. Together, they could face whatever challenges came next. And for Lily, the revelation marked the first step toward reclaiming her life, with Jacob as her steadfast protector, guide, and ally. The sun hung high above the horizon, spilling golden light across the ranch. After the tension-filled nights and the adrenaline of confrontation, the world seemed almost serene, as if it had paused to allow Jacob and Lily a moment of peace. The air carried the faint scent of wildflowers and fresh hay, mingling with the earthy aroma of the fields. For the first time in what felt like forever, the two could breathe without the shadow of fear pressing over them. Jacob had spent years isolated on this land, each day measured by routine and survival. Loneliness had been his companion, and grief his constant shadow. Yet now, with Lily by his side, there was a quiet companionship, fragile but tangible. They moved through the ranch together, checking the fences, tending the livestock, and performing small chores, but every action was underscored by a newfound connection. The girl who had arrived in a sack, terrified and vulnerable, was slowly transforming into someone who could trust again, and Jacob, in turn, was rediscovering his capacity for care and empathy. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Jacob prepared simple food, eggs, bread, and hot tea, and encouraged Lily to eat, knowing that nourishment was as much about healing the body as it was the soul. She sat beside him, hands wrapped around the warm cup, taking in the routine of life that was now steady and predictable. Conversation flowed naturally, a contrast to the fragmented, fearful words of past days. They spoke of the ranch, of small dreams, and of things that were theirs to enjoy without the threat of danger. Laughter even emerged, soft and tentative, signaling a return to a semblance of normalcy. As the day wore on, Jacob began to help Lily understand the next steps in reclaiming her life. Legal matters, reclaiming her inheritance, and confronting The manipulations of her uncle were daunting tasks, but together they formed a plan. What had once seemed impossible, the survival of a frightened girl, now became a story of empowerment, strategy, and partnership. Jacob's protection had given Lily safety. His guidance would help her navigate the challenges ahead. Beyond practical matters, there was emotional healing taking place. Jacob encouraged her to speak of her fears, her trauma, and her feelings, providing a patient ear and unwavering support. Lily, in turn, began to allow herself to rely on another person. The wall she had built for protection slowly gave way to trust, and she discovered that the world could still hold kindness and hope. Each shared moment strengthened the bond between them, transforming fear into courage and isolation into connection. By evening, they stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The land stretched endlessly. Before them, a symbol of freedom and the possibilities of the future. Jacob placed a steady hand on Lily's shoulder. "You've come a long way," he said quietly, "and you're stronger than you realize." She smiled faintly, a smile that carried relief, gratitude, and the beginnings of confidence. The dangers of the past had not been erased entirely. They would remain as lessons and reminders, but they no longer defined them. Instead, Jacob and Lily had forged a new beginning, one marked by resilience, trust, and the bond that only true adversity could create. The girl who had pleaded from within a sack was now reclaiming her life, and the lonely rancher had discovered a purpose he had thought lost forever. As night fell and the stars emerged, Jacob and Lily prepared for rest, knowing tomorrow would bring challenges but also hope. The journey from terror to safety, from fear to trust, had been arduous, but it had led them to a profound realization. Healing is possible, even after darkness, and new beginnings often come in the most unexpected ways. Together they faced the horizon, ready to step forward into a life built on courage, care, and the shared strength of survival.